Hello and welcome to another episode of Is It Bloody Working? I'm JJ Stenhouse and I'm here with my co-host Alexia Leachman. Now, Alexia is also co-founder with me in a business called Ladder of Growth, and Ladder of Growth is sponsoring today's episode, in which we are going to be talking about consciousness and what that really means. But first of all, Alexia, let's just give people an idea of what we've been up to lately.
Well, there's been a lot going on at Ladder of Growth. So Ladder of Growth is a tool that helps you measure, track, and manage your personal and professional growth. And that enables you to focus on particular areas in your life that you might be focusing on in terms of developing or growing or sorting out, so that you can have the information available to you that helps you measure, track, and manage it. So with that in mind, what we've got a number of profiles that we've been busy building behind the scenes. And they're at various stages of production. Some of them are live, some of them are nearly live, some of them are still in testing. So the ones that we've got that are currently live are the ADHD operating profile. So that enables you to understand what you're operating, like what your version of ADHD is, how it operates, how it works. And this isn't about whether or not you have it or you don't. It's if you have ADHD traits, to understand how they work with each other and how you can better use it. So you don't feel like you're being beaten in by it, but you feel like you're in control of it, right? So that's what the ADHD operating profile is. We've also got an anxiety pattern tracking profile. So this is all about understanding what your profile of anxiety is based on the work that I've been doing on the head trash, and understanding that there are 6 core drivers behind anxiety. So when you get your anxiety profile, you know which are your drivers of anxiety and where it flares up. What's the one that's kind of amplifying everything? What might be the best place for you to focus on so you can start resolving your anxiety. And the great thing about this profile is you can use it on your own, you can use it to pair it up with self-help work that you're doing, or you can take it into therapy and give a version of it to your therapist to help you with whatever you're working on in therapy. So that's the anxiety one. And then the other one that we've got going on in the background, which is really exciting, is a business owner profile. And this is for the business owners, the entrepreneurs, the founders, to help them to understand what their own growth journey looks like as a business owner. Because if you are a business owner and you've been doing your own thing in the entrepreneurial world, then you'll know that there's so many aspects that you have to come up against, and resistance and things you have to work through on that journey. And that profile helps to bring that to the surface, make it like visible for you, so you can go, right, okay, actually I need a visibility coach. Oh no, actually I need to be better at delegating and letting things go so I can get people on board. All of those kind of things. So that's the business owner profile we're also doing. So yeah, that's just a few of the things that we're looking at. We've got a leadership one coming up soon. We've also got a workplace one, so you can start looking at what's going on in the workplace. Lots more that we're going to share with you as we go on. But I'm going to wrap it up there because I want to dive into today's conversation because it's a really juicy one, right, JJ?
Well, it is. But before we do that, I must shout out to having a little bit of a go at the website. Where we're really revamping the website, so it's going to be looking fantastic very soon. So watch out for that, ladderofgrowth.io. Yes, but consciousness. Now, consciousness, if you've been in the spiritual world or the personal development world for any length of time, you'll hear that word consciousness. And you may just think it's a bit woo-woo, it's a bit nebulous, it isn't really, it isn't tangible. But actually, consciousness is a tangible and measurable thing, isn't it, Alexia? It's about capacity. It's about how much we can hold. Think about it. When people say raising levels of consciousness, if I can say the word, what they really are talking about is expanding within ourselves so that we can hold a whole lot of energy, stresses. We can manage our lives much better. That's kind of it, isn't it?
Yeah. And I know that I've been kind of sucked into a lot of these like little side alleys, if you like, the word consciousness. And there are many sort of very gifted healers and people that therapeutic work that have even come out openly and say, well, I'm not going to use that definition of consciousness. For me, consciousness is this. And they come out with their new definition. And what that means is everyone's confused and doesn't really know what's going on or what it means. And so they disengage with the term, which is terrible, because actually, excuse me, it's a very useful term to get your head around. And the way that I like to think about it is how that your outlook, the way that you interact with the world, the way that you respond to the world, the way that you behave. based on your perspective. Because the thing about consciousness is it does shift. We've seen this, we're going to talk about this, how it does move and shift, but it does enable you to have a certain outlook, a certain perspective. You see certain things a certain way, you respond in a certain way. These are all very concrete things. So, to take it out, we need to take it out this spiritual landscape where it's become a little bit fuzzy and a little bit warm and, gooey and a bit wooey, if you like, and bring it into the practical and the grounded. Because when we do that, actually, there's a lot that we can learn from getting a better understanding of consciousness and therefore how we can start bringing about shifts in our own consciousness. Because the research does tell us that there's stuff going on within consciousness and it does move. So we're not, it isn't this fluffy spiritual concept. It is a grounded idea. And we need to reclaim it so we can start having meaningful conversations about what it is so that we can all raise our consciousness in a meaningful way, right?
Yeah. And, looking at the research, psychologists have been looking into, the difference between personality and consciousness and, whether we can measure any of it and what that all means. But just before we go on to some of that, I just think that for me, consciousness is a state. And the more consciousness you can hold, the more you are able to flourish. I kind of think of it that way. So it's an expansiveness. And when we talk about growing our consciousness, it's an expansion of our ability to hold energy, where, whether we can deal with stress, whether we can move forward in our life. So psychologists talk about capacity and load. They talk about load being emotional load, stresses, that sort of thing. This is what I think consciousness is. It's just another way of describing what the psychologists call load and capacity.
Yeah. And I know that when I was getting to grips with the work that I was doing, which is, with my work at Head Trash and where I've observed people as they heal, they've been raising consciousness, but I wasn't able to articulate that, or I didn't realize that that's what I was seeing early in my own work. And the way that I was interpreting it back then was, and I found the mental health continuum, which was a helpful something for me to kind of go, oh yeah, that spectrum, that continuum makes sense. And so we're now speaking in terms of emotional resilience, mental health, emotional health, and we see, and also we understand that low levels of consciousness, we hear people saying, oh, well, they're in victim consciousness, they're in scarcity mode, they're driven by fear and anxiety. And so all of this does speak to that. And as you start shedding your fears and shedding your anxieties and no longer being driven by survival or by scarcity or by victim consciousness, now you're also, somebody that has high levels of emotional resilience they're not being driven by fear and scarcity in that way. So we start seeing that there's lots of overlapping models that exist in the world already that are hinting at consciousness. They've just been looking through various lenses, but actually the consciousness, like the map of consciousness from Dr. David R. Hawkins, that seems to be this kind of unifying lens, if you like. The idea of consciousness is where a lot of those other models sit on top. So I think if we can distill it to what is essentially the most simplest form of looking at this and understand that things like emotional resilience and our ability to have increased capacity, deal with more load, all of that, the common denominator is consciousness.
Yeah. Yes. It's not being able to ascend and take ourselves off the planet, is it? Which I think is what a lot of people confuse with consciousness. Yeah. They think it's this spiritual ascension idea.
And there's 3D, 4D, 5D conversations going on.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So are we moving into, I don't know where we are now. People talk about 5D and all of that sort of thing, but this is not what consciousness is in my view and in my experience as well. So, and the thing about consciousness is that you can measure it, can't you?
Yeah. Well, and this is where Dr. David R. Hawkins, he huge body of work where he developed his map of consciousness model, where he started demonstrating that this is measurable and that it could be consistently measured. And yes, there are questions about the way that he went about doing that measurement, but you can't deny the significance of his body of work, and particularly how the ideas that he's been proposing in terms of the varying levels of consciousness are reflected in many other big thinkers of our time. And the biggest one that comes to my mind, and certainly I'm a big fan of, is Caroline Myss. And, she's done a lot of work in this area. And I don't think she probably uses the word consciousness a lot, but actually she's still talking about that. And her model, the one that she talks about a lot, is she uses a metaphor, that the apartment building. And so for those of you that know her work, you'll know what I'm talking about. But for those of you that haven't, let me just give you a quick tour. She describes an apartment building in New York. Now, if you're living on the ground floor, it's going to be really noisy. You're going to be worried about people breaking your window, jumping in through the window off the pavement. It's going to be, you're going to have survival worries. You're going to be worried about the noise, the pollution, and feeling safe where you are, and being disrupted and having interference, right? You're all going to be all about the survival. But then if you move to the second floor, the third floor of the same apartment building, suddenly it's not as noisy. Suddenly you've got a different perspective on the street. If you go up to the fifth floor, well, now you can see the park in the next block. And if you get to the penthouse, now you can see the river. You can see Central Park. It's a whole different view. And in fact, it might even be quite peaceful on the penthouse, whereas on the ground floor, the person going peaceful, there's no way that this address is peaceful. So you've got the same address, but different levels, right? And so as you go higher in the apartment building, it becomes more costly. Obviously, penthouse suites cost more than the ground floor flat. And in terms of consciousness, what that means is the cost isn't about money. It's about the time, effort that you spend on the inner work to raise your level of consciousness. Because to get to the penthouse in terms of consciousness, that means doing a lot of inner work, right? And when you get there, you've got a whole different perspective on the world that you live in. You are still the same person. The personality has not changed. But now you have a whole different outlook, a whole different way of responding to the world, a whole different way of navigating, viewing the world in front of you, interpreting it. And that is what we're talking about here. It's about, we're not changing the person, the essence of who you are. We're changing the way that you interact with what is around you and respond to it and behave. And that's meaningful. That's grounded. We can all work with that, because that kind of stuff shows up in everything that we do. The way that we work, the way that we're at home, the way with our families. This is why consciousness is relevant. We've got to bring it back into mainstream, because if we could get a better understanding of this as a collective, we could all be using it meaningfully to improve our lives. And that's what we want to be doing at Ladder of Growth, is helping you to have visibility on where you're at with your level of consciousness, so you can deploy it mindfully and deliberately so that it can serve you well.
That's right. And, the research has moved on as well in psychology terms, because there was a time when researchers used to believe that, you were one way and that's the way you would be forever. You couldn't shift anything, right? You had a baseline and that was fixed. And
and Dr. David Hawkins said, even in his books, he says that you're not likely to shift more than 5 points in a lifetime. So even he says that as well, right?
Right. But we've moved on from there. And there is now research that says, actually, some things can be shifted. And it's actually a moving bit of research, I think. So we're seeing more and more research that's showing more and more that we might not have a fixed set point, but a fixed set range of capability, let's put it that way, right? And so we've seen that develop over the last few decades, and people are beginning to see, no, actually, we're not a fixed thing. And the other thing is that it's not about personality either. Personality and consciousness are not the same thing. So, your personality might be fixed, although I'm sure that we can all do things that will mitigate against certain aspects of our personality. But consciousness, it isn't a fixed entity. We can shift it. And there has been research that showed quite clearly how over a set period of time, we can move the needle in terms of what we are able to hold within ourselves, how we can adapt, change. Doesn't mean that we change as a person. It means that we can change in terms of what we can deal with and handle as a person. That kind of sums it up. I mean, there's a whole load of research that I'm sure that we'll, post a blog about at some point in the near future. but just for today, that's kind of sums it up.
Yeah, there's one bit of research that I'm quite interested in, I just want to mention though. There's this one research that says, and this is by Licken and Tellegen in '96, and then also there's another one. I'm not even going to try and say. I'll try and say it. Lyubomirsky and Sheldon and Gage.
Lyubomirsky.
Okay, you're much better than I am. And I found this quite interesting. They said they proposed roughly a 50% genetic makeup in terms of our personality. Then there's 10% which is circumstance, and 40% which is intentional activity. Which means that this intentional activity, that potentially that is this huge chunk of our well-being that's movable. And maybe that is what they're kind of suggesting, that is the consciousness piece. But I'm interested in knowing what this 50% genetic piece is. I mean, is that what they're proposing as being the fixed personality?
I think that is. Yeah, no, I think that is what they're proposing, is the fixed personality. But I suspect that, when we do even more research into all of this, that will change. I suspect that those numbers won't stay the same.
And what's interesting is when I've been reading around personality, like, for example, one of the things that we were reading in preparation for today was talking around, extrovert or introvert.
Yeah.
And with the work that I've been doing at Head Trash, that I can quite categorically say, based on my own lived experience of myself and my clients, that is not a personality trait. When you are introvert, then you're deliberately kind of keeping yourself in a safe place. So your energy isn't being drained by things that drain you. We often hear introverts saying, well, being in a social environment drains me and I have to recover for a couple of days and go inward. That's not personality that drains your energy. That's being triggered. That's your nervous system.
Exactly.
Right. So, and then when you then shift in, extroverts, on the other hand, they're not necessarily being drained. They're not being drained by the social. They're being drained by being on their own because they can't handle their own company. I was one of those people, right? When you've done the healing, you can now go out and be social whenever you want. And when you decide you don't want to do it, you go home. And you can also be at home whenever you want, on your own for days. Don't get triggered. You're fine with that. You can do both. And we're seeing a lot of people, I've seen something come up a lot in my social feeds right now about a new type of introvert extrovert called the ottrovert. And they're people that can be introvert and extrovert. And it's like,
everybody can be introvert and extrovert, can't they?
That's what having neutrality around that is. And that's what I've observed in myself, is I can just be on my own for a week and be fine, or I can go off and be super social for a week, and I can do both, because neutrality enables you to entertain both equally without having your energy drained. So Correct. This, for me, is not a personality piece. And I suspect there'll be we could probably do a whole episode just on this piece alone. But I think what this raises for me is, well, what the hell is personality anyway? Maybe there are aspects of personality that are actually consciousness anyway. And so maybe personality is a lot smaller in terms of the percentage of how we present than we think. That's a question I'm just putting out there.
No, it is a good question. And how much of that is down to genetics? How much of that is down to socialization? And obviously there are other elements involved here, as you're being socialized at a young age, of possibly trauma, that sort of thing. That must all impact what's seen as personality. I used to be an introvert. You wouldn't believe that. You probably don't believe that at all. But I used to be incredibly introverted. It was really painful. I was painfully shy. And, found it very difficult to go out and be in company that I didn't know, right? It would be very difficult for me to do that. But that was because I was spending so much energy keeping it all together.
Yeah. Well, that's a trauma response, right?
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Keep yourself safe. Yeah. And we know that now. So I think we need to revisit what we think of as personality, but we're not going to do that today. But I think that does open a very interesting can of worms for another time, because it may be actually we're more the percentage in terms of what is it about us that makes us us. Maybe there's more of that's consciousness that maybe we all realize, and I think that might be.
Yeah, no, I think it bears a lot more investigation, a lot more research, and I mean. The thing is, we're labelled, aren't we? We're constantly labelled as being X personality or that, or an introvert or an extrovert. I don't think those labels are very helpful. Do you?
No, I think they're not helpful, because people then, like you often hear people saying, "Oh, I'm an ENFP or whatever the
Yeah.
Myers-Briggs profile is they are," and they wear that with pride. And I know when I've joined the school platform, SKOOL, that you can add your Myers-Briggs profile to your own personal profile. I'm like, this is crazy.
Mm.
The way that people adopt these labels and then almost allow the label to dictate who they are and how they show up. And it's easy to do that because as you're grappling with a sense of who you are, and I know from, I would say, most of my 20s and probably half of my 30s, I was like, well, I don't know who I am. Who am I? And so you do a profile, you go, oh, right, I'm an ENFP or whatever it is,
Mm.
INFJ. And then you're like, okay, right, okay, that's me. And now you've got something concrete to hold on to and go, right, okay, that means that I behave like this. And that means I'm not good in these situations, but I am good in those situations. Well, how much of that is you then fulfilling that? Because you're now
Exactly.
working to a label as opposed to allowing the true you to kind of reveal itself and grow. So I'm not 100% comfortable with these profiles that are fixed. I think we are a movable thing. And I like to think of the sea and water. We are 80% water. And you think about the sea or water or a river being fixed, and people just laugh at you. And of course, not. How can you box in a river? You can't. Even if you put the water in a box and try walking around it, it's going to splosh about everywhere because it's not fixed, it's fluid. And when I think about our levels of consciousness and the way that we're working with the ladder of growth, I've gone to the sea as my main source of inspiration because I think it's useful for us to think about what our baseline is and what our upper capacity is and what our floor is, where we fall to when times are tough, right? Where we hit reactive behaviors. And there is some research around this baseline versus weather that we've picked up on, isn't there? There's some research
Yeah.
by Brickman, Coates and Bowman from
Mm.
1978. And they found that lottery winners were no happier a year on than non-winners, which, indicates that there's a baseline that even when you have something like that, like winning a load of money, it doesn't really change your fundamental baseline. So having an understanding of that, I think is really, really important. And I think the sea gives us this way of doing that. You think about the sea level in a port and you see where the watermark is against where the boats are, and you go, right, that's the sea level. But we know that, there's going to be waves that come in and go over the port, and then it's going to go down and the tide's going to come in and out. There's going to be movement going on there. And there's that same movement is happening for us. On a day when somebody says, hey, your hair looks amazing. Oh my God. And you've just had a great day and it's sunny, and your mates have all just come around and just had a great weekend at a music festival, then you're going to be on your peak. You're going to be feeling amazing. But suddenly you get some bad news and you're going to fall down. You're going to get really upset for a few days. And so that capacity between where you are when you've just had a great day and the wind is in your sails and when you haven't, that's your ceiling and your floor. But you don't spend your day in those places. Well, sometimes you do. So this is where I think it's useful to have an understanding of a baseline, but also
Yeah.
what your floor is, and then what your ceiling capacity is, right?
Yeah. And, your feelings do shift. You feel different at any given time. I feel different at various times during the day, no matter what's going on. Even if nothing's going on, something can trigger me into a different state, right?
Yeah.
But it's a question of how you recover from that, how you come back to what your baseline is. We can't always live in a state of euphoria, or maybe we can, but it's not very practical, is it? So we don't always want to be down in the dumps, but it's how quickly we can get back to that baseline and sort of moving backwards and forwards across it, and understanding that, when we think about what's going on in our life, what reality is, it'll be different depending on where we are. Our reality will look different to us. We'll interpret it differently depending on where we are around that baseline. So, it's understanding that we are all things at different times. But the important idea to hold on to is strengthening that baseline.
Mm. And therefore, and also where you're falling to, like your floor, because
Right.
certainly with my own life experience and with the clients I work with, when I observe the shifts that people go through as a result of doing clearance work, the floor definitely shifts, right? And
Yes.
so and that what's the way that I can categorically say that is that, when you take the same situation and you have that same situation happen, let's say 6 months apart, a year apart,
Yeah.
and your response to that is very, very different in a very significant way, that tells you right there that your baseline has shifted, that your floor has shifted, because you're now responding in a whole different way. And I'll give you an example. So I was working with a guy, I call him six-figure burnout guy, because he burned out and he was doing six figures and like an executive director in London. And he was signed off work for like 3 weeks or so with burnout, and he couldn't function. He just crashed, right? And he was worried like crazy that he would be exited, because a lot of people at that level, when they burn out, they just exit out of the business. So he thought he was going to lose his job, father of three kids, the main breadwinner. It was a real like, what am I going to do? It's going to be a nightmare. We're going to have to leave London. We're going to have to move out. I'm going to tell them all. I'm going to have to tell my kids I'm a failure. It's just going to be, it was a huge disaster as far as he was concerned. Massive catastrophizing pattern going on there. We did the work. He shifted massively in a very short amount of time, like 4 weeks. And then 6 months later, he found out he was being made redundant, along with like a huge, like 30% of the workforce. So it wasn't him particularly. And now he's not bothered. He's like, oh, I'm just going to get another job. And it's like, well, hang on a minute. Like 6 months ago, you were completely freaking out about this situation and you couldn't see a way out. You were going to be selling up in London. It's just going to be a big disaster. And now you're like, well, it doesn't matter. I'm just going to get another job. Not the same situation. This was a very real situation now. And he wasn't even fazed by it, got another job in a couple of months. And it wasn't even a notable experience in his previous year. Whereas when it happened to him, when he had in his previous state, he hit a floor and he was not in a well-resourced place. So we can speak to this idea of the baseline changing. And I've seen it time and time again. And so I think it's useful for us to have an understanding of this when we think about where we're at, because it gives us something to work with. And especially if you are doing inner work, because you're like, I really want to raise my baseline, because actually my baseline it's not serving me right now. And I'm freaking out over everything. I'm getting triggered about everything. I'm not well resourced. I panic over everything. I get overwhelmed easily. You want to get out of that place, right? You want to get out of that place in a place where you're not getting overwhelmed. You're not in panic zone all the time. You're not hyperventilating. Your nervous system isn't getting fried all the time because you're getting triggered all the time. You want to get out of that place, and raising your baseline is what that's about.
Yeah. Yeah. It's and I'm going to just ask everybody who's listening to think about where that might be in a moment when we go to our normal sit spot, where we leave you with a thought to ponder. But before we do that, we're coming to the end, I think, now. Consciousness is it's a real measurable thing. It's not woo-woo. I'm just thinking, what do we want people to go away with, having listened to all of this, Alexia? What action do we want them to take, do you think?
I think it's useful to kind of sit with what we shared and think about, that's what our sit spot's going to do. It's like, where do you think you are? And we've created a tool where you can go and see on the Ladder of Growth website that's a little bit similar to the Dr. David R. Hawkins map of consciousness, but we think a little bit more grounded in terms of something recognizable mental and emotional states where you can identify quite easily. Because I think the most important thing, if you are committed to a personal growth journey, and I think a lot of people that might be listening to this are, whether that means you're a personal development enthusiast, you've got a library full of self-help books, or maybe you're a coach or a therapist, or you work in that kind of area, then but also the business people listening that maybe they're heading up leadership programs or coaching within executive environments. The one thing you always need is a starting point. You need to know, where are we at now, right? So that's why I want to invite you to think, well, where are you at now? How resilient do you think you are? How quickly do you come back to baseline? If you get knocked for six, how long does that last? Is it for the day? Is it for the hour? Is it for the month? How long do you do you stay at your low when you get knocked there? How quickly can you come back up? But also, how easily can you access those higher states of consciousness? And I don't mean kind of, the druggy high. I'm talking about your ability to tap into your intuition, to think clearly, to make decisions without navigating your fear committee, your doubt committee, your trigger committee on the way. You can just make a decision without worrying all the time. That's the kind of stuff that you can draw in when you are at a higher level of consciousness. So where do you think you are based on the things that we've been talking about today? Because that is the most important thing to know, is where you're starting from. And then like, okay, right, I'm here, I'm at level 2, I'm at level 3 or whatever. Right. And I want to get to level 4. What do I need to do?
Yeah. Yes, indeed. And we will be coming back to this time and time again, no doubt. But we were talking more about consciousness as well, and all of the things we've mentioned here today in later episodes. We'll be going into a lot of it in more depth. But for now, I think that wraps it up. So, yeah, what's your baseline right now? Go away and have a think about that. Sit down for a few moments sometime today and ask yourself, what is my baseline? Do you know, I don't think I'd ever asked myself that question ever until I started working with Ladder of Growth, actually.
Yeah.
So, ask yourself, it's an interesting question. Ask yourself, can you tell what your baseline is right now? But that's not how you feel today, right? But where do you come back to when you've had a shock or when something fantastic has happened? What's your sea level line? And it would be great to hear from you as well. Contact us through our Substack and let us know what your experiences are. But for now, from me, JJ, and from Alexia, that's goodbye from us. See you in the next one.
Bye.